In the pouring Texas rain, Rebecca Hayes clutched her 6-year-old son as their belongings scattered across the muddy sidewalk. But 200 yards away, a massive Brahman bull named Thunder suddenly stopped grazing and lifted his enormous head. The 1,200-pound beast had never reacted to strangers in 3 years, not since the day his master never came home from Afghanistan. Thunder's nostrils flared wide, his dark eyes fixed on something invisible to human senses. The gentle giant, who hadn't left his pasture in months, began pacing frantically along the fence line, letting out deep, rumbling calls that echoed across the empty ranch like a distress signal from another world. 67-year-old Jake Thompson dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against his porch steps. His weathered hands trembled as he watched Thunder's agitation escalate to levels he'd never witnessed. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered. But Thunder's massive frame was already moving toward the gate with supernatural determination. What had triggered this reaction? And why now, when Jake needed silence most? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Jake Thompson had built his life around silence. At 67, the Vietnam veteran carried more ghosts than memories, his weathered face telling stories of battles fought both overseas and within his own mind. The bronze star gathering dust on his mantelpiece meant nothing compared to the phantom pain in his missing right leg, a daily reminder of the IED that had stolen his youth in 1971. His 80-acre ranch outside Austin, Texas, stretched like a sanctuary between him and a world that had moved on without him. Since Mary's death from cancer 3 years ago, Jake had spoken more words to Thunder than to any human being. The massive Brahman bull had arrived as a rescued calf, brought by Jake's old army buddy Carlos Martinez, who'd claimed the animal needed a good home before deploying to Afghanistan. "This bull's got heart, Jake," Carlos had said, his calloused hands gentle on the young calf's head. "He'll keep you company when I'm gone." Thunder had grown into something extraordinary, 200 pounds of muscle and intelligence wrapped in a coat of black with reddish-brown markings that caught the Texas sun like burnished copper. Unlike other bulls, Thunder possessed an almost supernatural gentleness, responding to commands with the discipline of a trained soldier. He'd never shown aggression toward humans, preferring to watch the world with dark, knowing eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. The ranch had become Jake's fortress against the world. His VA disability check barely covered expenses, but it kept him fed and Thunder healthy. Most days, Jake's routine remained unchanged. Dawn patrol around the property, checking fences, talking to Thunder about everything and nothing. The bull listened with the patience of a therapist, occasionally nudging Jake's shoulder with his massive head when the old soldier's voice cracked, talking about Mary or the war. Jake hadn't left the ranch in 6 months. The outside world felt too sharp, too demanding, filled with people who couldn't understand the weight he carried. Survivor's guilt ate at him like acid. Why had he lived when so many good men died? Why had Mary suffered through cancer while he remained healthy? The questions tormented him through sleepless nights when Thunder's presence in the nearby pasture provided the only comfort. But Thunder had never behaved like this. The bull's agitation was unlike anything Jake had witnessed in their 3 years together. Thunder paced the fence line with increasing urgency, his massive hooves churning the muddy ground. Deep, resonant calls erupted from his throat, not the casual lowing of cattle, but something more primal, more urgent. Jake grabbed his rein slicker and limped toward the pasture, his prosthetic leg making the journey treacherous on the slick ground. Thunder's dark eyes locked onto his, and Jake saw something that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was Thunder responding to something specific, something that had triggered a recognition Jake couldn't understand. "What is it, boy?" Jake whispered, reaching through the fence to touch Thunder's massive neck. "What's got you so worked up?" Thunder's answer came in another rumbling call, his eyes never leaving the direction of town. The eviction notice had arrived 3 weeks ago, but Rebecca Hayes had clung to hope until the very last moment. Standing in the doorway of the cramped apartment that had been home for 2 years, she watched Sheriff's Deputy Williams apologetically oversee the removal of her life's remaining possessions. The rain had started an hour ago, turning what should have been a private humiliation into a public spectacle. "Mama, why are they taking our things?" Tommy's small voice cut through the sound of raindrops hitting cardboard boxes. At 6 years old, he possessed his father's dark eyes and serious expression, clutching a worn toy soldier that had been Carlos's final gift before deploying to Afghanistan. Rebecca knelt beside her son, her teacher's instincts kicking in even as her world collapsed around them. "Sometimes grown-ups have to move, sweetheart. We're going on an adventure." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. Rebecca Hayes had been Rebecca Martinez until 18 months ago, when the casualty notification officers had arrived at her door with news that Sergeant Carlos Martinez had been killed by an improvised explosive device outside Kabul. The life insurance money was supposed to ensure Tommy's future: college, a stable home, the dreams Carlos had whispered about during late-night video calls from his base. Frank Morrison, the apartment complex owner, stood under the building's overhang, his expensive suit protected from the rain, while Rebecca and Tommy got soaked. His cold eyes showed no compassion as he supervised the systematic destruction of their security. "Should have thought about this before missing 3 months' rent," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never missed a meal. "I've got a business to run here." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Please, Mr. Morrison, just until Friday. My paycheck from the diner will clear, and I can give you something toward—" "I've heard it all before, lady." Morrison waved a dismissive hand. "You people always got an excuse. Empty promises don't pay my mortgage." Deputy Williams shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this. If you've got somewhere to go—" But Rebecca didn't have anywhere to go. The 3 part-time jobs, waitressing at Murphy's Diner, cleaning offices at night, and weekend childcare for neighbors, barely covered food and utilities. Carlos's brother Marcus had convinced her to invest the life insurance money in what he'd called guaranteed returns. For 3 years, Marcus Webb had been the picture of family support, helping with paperwork, offering financial advice, always with a reassuring smile and promises that the money was growing safely. The promises had been lies. Every phone call to Marcus now went straight to voicemail. Every text message remained unanswered. The investments had vanished like smoke, and Rebecca was too ashamed to tell anyone how completely she'd been betrayed by the man she'd trusted as a brother. Tommy pressed closer to his mother as strangers carried out their kitchen table, the one where he did homework every night while Rebecca graded papers from her former teaching job. She'd lost that position when budget cuts hit the school district, another domino falling in a chain of disasters that had started with Carlos's death. "Mama, I'm scared," Tommy whispered, rainwater dripping from his dark hair. Rebecca pulled him closer, her own fear threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She'd been strong for so long, through Carlos's deployment, through the devastating phone call, through the funeral where Thunder had stood at attention while taps played. But watching their belongings get soaked in the rain while her son shivered against her side, Rebecca felt something inside her breaking. The apartment had never been much. A living room that doubled as Tommy's bedroom, a tiny kitchen with appliances from the 1980s, and a single bedroom where Rebecca spent sleepless nights worrying about money. But it had been theirs. It had been home. It was where Tommy had taken his first steps after Carlos deployed, where Rebecca had cried herself to sleep after the funeral, where they'd built a small life from the wreckage of their dreams. Now even that was gone. Deputy Williams approached with reluctant authority. Ma'am, you and your son need to clear the premises. I can give you a few more minutes to gather personal items, but then—" "I understand," Rebecca said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rain. She looked down at Tommy, whose toy soldier was getting wet in his small fist. Carlos had bought it at the PX before his final mission, telling her in a video call to give it to Tommy if something happened. "Tell him his daddy was a soldier who kept his promises," Carlos had said, his voice crackling through the poor internet connection. "Tell him real soldiers protect the people they love." Standing in the rain with nowhere to go, Rebecca wondered how she was supposed to explain to her son that sometimes even soldiers' promises couldn't protect them from the cruelty of the world. Jake had learned to trust Thunder's instincts more than his own. 3 years of living together had taught him that the bull possessed an intelligence that bordered on the uncanny, an ability to sense things that escaped human perception. When Thunder refused to calm down, continuing his agitated pacing and deep rumbling calls, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. "All right, boy," Jake muttered, limping toward the barn where he kept his cattle trailer. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." Loading Thunder into the trailer was normally a simple task. The bull had been trained well and trusted Jake completely. But today, Thunder's urgency was palpable. He climbed into the trailer without hesitation, then immediately moved to the front, pressing his massive head against the metal bars as if trying to see through them toward town. Jake's old pickup truck groaned under the weight as they pulled out of the ranch. He hadn't driven into Austin in months, and the familiar anxiety began clawing at his chest. Too many people, too much noise, too many reminders of a world that had moved on without him. But Thunder's continued agitation overrode Jake's personal discomfort. The drive into town took 20 minutes, with Thunder becoming increasingly restless in the trailer behind him. Jake could hear the bull's hooves shifting, could feel the trailer rocking slightly as Thunder moved from side to side. Whatever was calling to him was getting stronger. As they approached the outskirts of town, Jake spotted the commotion. Sheriff's vehicles, a small crowd of onlookers, and the unmistakable scene of an eviction in progress. His first instinct was to drive past. This wasn't his business, and he had enough problems of his own. But Thunder's reaction was immediate and undeniable. The bull let out a sound Jake had never heard before, not quite a bellow, not quite a moan, but something that spoke of recognition and distress. Thunder began throwing his weight against the trailer walls, not violently, but with clear intention. He wanted out, and he wanted out now. Jake pulled to the curb, his hand shaking slightly as he turned off the engine. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see a young woman and a small boy standing helplessly as their belongings were carried out into the rain. The woman was trying to shield the child from both the weather and the humiliation, her body language speaking of defeat and desperation. But it was the boy who caught Jake's attention, dark-haired, serious-faced, clutching something in his small hands, a toy soldier. The sight hit Jake like a physical blow. Memories of his own service flooding back. Memories of friends who'd left behind children they'd never see grow up. Thunder's agitation reached a crescendo. The trailer was actually rocking now as the bull threw his weight against the walls with increasing urgency. Jake had seen Thunder react to distressed calves, to injured animals, but never to humans. Never like this. "What is it, Thunder?" Jake whispered, but he already knew he was going to find out. Jake climbed out of the truck, his prosthetic leg making the process awkward in the rain. He moved to the back of the trailer where Thunder was pressing his massive head against the bars, his dark eyes fixed on the woman and child. The bull's entire body language spoke of protective instinct, of recognition, of something Jake couldn't quite understand. The scene was heartbreaking. The woman, she couldn't be more than 35, was clearly at the end of her rope. Her clothes were soaked, her hair plastered to her head, but she maintained a dignity that reminded Jake of military wives he'd known. strong women who'd learned to carry burdens too heavy for their shoulders. The landlord, a well-dressed man who was staying dry under the building's overhang, was clearly enjoying his position of power. Jake recognized the type, men who'd never served, never sacrificed, but who felt entitled to lord their authority over those less fortunate. "Should have thought about this before missing 3 months' rent," the landlord was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the rain. "I've got a business to run here." Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, righteous anger, not the bitter rage that had consumed him since Mary's death, but the clean, focused anger of a soldier witnessing injustice. Behind him, Thunder continued his urgent calls, as if trying to communicate something vital. The woman was pleading now, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Please, Mr. Morrison, just until Friday. My paycheck from the diner will clear and I can give you something toward—" "I've heard it all before, lady. You people always got an excuse." The dismissive cruelty in the man's voice triggered something in Jake. He'd heard officers talk to enlisted men that way, seen bureaucrats treat Gold Star families with the same contempt. His military bearing, dormant for months, suddenly reasserted itself. Jake walked forward with purpose, his limp barely noticeable as adrenaline overrode physical limitations. The small crowd parted before him. Something about his presence, his obvious military background, commanded respect even from strangers. "That's enough," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led soldiers in combat. The conversation stopped. The landlord looked up, suddenly uncertain. Jake turned to the woman and child, noting how the boy instinctively stepped behind his mother, still clutching the toy soldier. "Ma'am, you and your son are coming with me." It wasn't a question. It was an order, delivered with the certainty of a man who expected to be obeyed. The silence inside Jake's ranch house was heavy with unspoken questions. Rebecca sat stiffly in a wooden chair by the fireplace, her wet clothes slowly drying in the warmth, while Tommy huddled beside her, wrapped in one of Mary's old quilts. The boy's eyes were wide with fascination and fear as he stared through the window at Thunder, who stood motionless in the nearby pasture, his massive form silhouetted against the gray sky. Jake busied himself building up the fire, his movements awkward as he tried to remember how to be a host. It had been 3 years since anyone other than the veterinarian had stepped foot in his home. The house felt too quiet, too empty, despite the presence of guests. Mary's photographs still lined the mantelpiece, and her coffee mug still sat unwashed in the sink. Small shrines to a life that had ended too soon. "Thank you," Rebecca said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jake grunted, poking at the fire with unnecessary force. "Couldn't stand by and watch that happen. Not to a military family." Rebecca's head snapped up. "How did you know Carlos was military?" "The boy," Jake nodded toward Tommy, who was still staring at Thunder. "That toy soldier. And you carry yourself like a military wife. I've seen enough of them to recognize the bearing." Through the window, Thunder had begun moving closer to the house, his massive hooves making soft thuds in the muddy ground. The bull's behavior was unlike anything Jake had witnessed in their 3 years together. Thunder typically kept his distance from the house, content to graze in the far pastures. But now he seemed drawn to the building, as if pulled by an invisible force. "What's wrong with him?" Rebecca asked, noticing Thunder's approach. "He looks agitated." "I don't know," Jake admitted, watching as Thunder positioned himself just outside the window where Tommy sat. "He's been acting strange all day. That's why I came into town. He was so worked up I thought something was wrong." Tommy pressed his small hand against the window glass, and Thunder immediately moved closer, lowering his massive head until his dark eyes were level with the boy's. The interaction was gentle, almost tender, despite the barrier between them. "He's big," Tommy whispered, his first words since arriving at the ranch. "But he looks sad." The observation hit Jake like a physical blow. Thunder did look sad, an expression Jake had never noticed before, or perhaps had never allowed himself to see. The bull's dark eyes held a weight that seemed almost human in its depth. "Can you tell me about your husband?" Jake asked Rebecca, settling into his own chair with a grunt of pain from his prosthetic leg. "Carlos? You said?" Rebecca's hands tightened in her lap. "Carlos Martinez, Sergeant, 2nd Infantry Division. He died 18 months ago in Afghanistan." Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the effort it took to maintain control. The name hit Jake like lightning. Martinez. Carlos Martinez. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Thunder's origin, his unusual training, the way the bull had reacted to Rebecca and Tommy. "Carlos Martinez," Jake repeated slowly, his mind racing. "Tall guy, dark hair, scar on his left hand from a training accident." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You knew him?" "I was his commanding officer during his 2nd deployment," Jake said, his voice thick with memory. "Good soldier, good man. He talked about his wife and son constantly, showed everyone pictures." Jake paused, studying Rebecca's face. "But how—" "Thunder was his calf." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Thunder, sensing the shift in conversation, began making soft vocalizations, not the distressed calls from earlier, but something gentler, more mournful. "Carlos brought Thunder here as a baby," Jake continued, the memories flooding back. "Said the calf needed a good home while he was deployed, but he never came back to get him." Rebecca's composure finally cracked. A sob escaped her throat, and she buried her face in her hands. "I never knew. Carlos never told me about bringing a calf here. He just said he'd made arrangements for us to be taken care of if something happened." Outside, Thunder pressed closer to the window, as if responding to Rebecca's distress. The bull's massive head moved back and forth, and he let out a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the glass. "He's trying to comfort her," Tommy said with the clear observation of a child. "Like when I'm sad and Mama hugs me." Jake stared at Thunder with new understanding. The bull's behavior wasn't random, it was purposeful. Carlos had trained him, prepared him for this exact scenario. But how much had Carlos anticipated? And what else had he planned? "Rebecca," Jake said gently, "you mentioned financial troubles. What happened to Carlos's life insurance?" The question opened a floodgate. Rebecca's story poured out. Marcus Webb, Carlos's brother, who'd convinced her to invest the insurance money. The gradual theft over 3 years, the broken promises, the mounting debt that had led to today's eviction. She spoke of her shame at being deceived, her inability to contact Carlos's military friends for help. "I couldn't bear to tell you all that I'd failed him," she whispered. "Carlos died to give Tommy a future, and I let someone steal it away." Jake listened in growing anger. He'd seen it before. Predators who targeted military families, especially widows who were vulnerable in their grief. The fact that it was family made it even more despicable. "Marcus Webb," Jake said, the name tasting bitter. "I remember him now. He came to Carlos's memorial service, smooth-talking, expensive suit. Even then, something felt off about him." Through the window, Thunder had settled into a lying position, his massive bulk creating a windbreak for the house. His eyes never left Tommy, who had fallen asleep against his mother's side, still clutching the toy soldier. "That bull's been waiting for you," Jake realized aloud. 3 years he's been here, and he's never acted protective of anyone. But the moment he sensed you and Tommy were in trouble— "That's impossible," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Animals don't— they can't." Don't underestimate what loyalty can do, Jake replied, thinking of his own bond with Thunder, or what a good soldier will do to keep his promises. As if summoned by the conversation, Thunder rose to his feet and walked to a different window, one that faced east toward Austin. He stood there like a sentinel, his massive frame outlined against the darkening sky. The bull's posture was alert, watchful, as if he were standing guard. "He's protecting us," Tommy said sleepily, startling the adults who thought he was asleep. "Daddy's bull is protecting us." The words sent chills down Jake's spine. How could a 6-year-old understand what two adults were struggling to accept? But looking at Thunder's vigilant stance, Jake felt the truth settling in his bones like an old ache. Carlos Martinez had been a thorough soldier, a man who planned for contingencies. Bringing Thunder to Jake's ranch hadn't been casual. It had been strategic. Carlos had known Jake lived alone, knew he was struggling with his own demons, knew he was a man who would honor his responsibilities to a fallen comrade's family. The bull had been more than a pet. He'd been an insurance policy, a bridge between Carlos's death and his family's future. Thunder's mysterious training, his protective instincts, his uncanny ability to sense when Rebecca and Tommy were in danger, it all pointed to a level of preparation that spoke of Carlos's deep love and foresight. "What do we do now?" Rebecca asked, exhaustion clear in her voice. Jake looked out at Thunder, still standing guard in the growing darkness. For the first time in 3 years, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with his own pain. "We figure out how to get your money back," he said with military certainty. "And we make sure Carlos's sacrifice meant something." Thunder turned his massive head toward the house as if he'd heard the promise. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the Texas sky, not the weather kind, but the sound of a storm that was finally ready to break. Dawn came gray and unwelcome, bringing with it the harsh reality of Rebecca's situation. Jake had given her and Tommy the guest bedroom, Mary's sewing room really, where dust motes danced in the weak morning light filtering through faded curtains. Rebecca had barely slept, her mind churning with the impossibility of their circumstances and the growing certainty that Thunder's behavior was more than coincidence. Over breakfast, Jake made phone calls to his old military network. His voice carried across the kitchen as he spoke to fellow veterans, each conversation adding another piece to the puzzle of Marcus Webb's deception. "Diana Walsh is our best bet," Jake said, hanging up the phone and turning to Rebecca. "Navy veteran, specializes in military family legal issues. She'll work pro bono, but—" He paused, his weathered face grim. "Without documentation, it's your word against Marcus's, and he's covered his tracks well." Rebecca's hands trembled around her coffee mug. "All the papers were in the apartment. If they weren't destroyed in the rain yesterday, they're probably gone by now." Through the kitchen window they could see Thunder in the pasture, but his behavior had changed again overnight. The massive bull was pacing the fence line, his attention focused not on the house but on something in the distance. Every few minutes he would stop and let out a deep, resonant call that echoed across the ranch. Tommy, who had been quietly eating cereal, suddenly looked up. "Thunder's calling for help." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked, though something in her son's simple observation made her skin prickle. "He's sad about the papers," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child. "He knows where they are." Jake and Rebecca exchanged glances. The boy's words were innocent enough, but Thunder's agitation seemed to support his observation in ways that defied rational explanation. "Tommy," Jake said carefully, "what makes you think Thunder knows about papers?" The boy shrugged, spooning more cereal into his mouth. "Daddy told him to remember. In the video." Rebecca's spoon clattered to the table. "What video, baby?" "The one Daddy made with Thunder, before the bad men hurt him." Tommy's face remained peaceful, as if he were discussing something as normal as a cartoon show. "Daddy said thunder was supposed to help us find things if we lost them." Jake felt the hair on his arm stand up. "Tommy, did your daddy show you this video?" "No, but I remember it. Thunder remembers it too." Tommy pointed toward the window where Thunder continued his pacing. "He's trying to tell us something important." Before anyone could respond, the phone rang. Jake answered with a gruff, "Thompson." Then his expression darkened as he listened. "That was Diana Walsh," he said after hanging up. "Marcus filed papers this morning to have Tommy placed in foster care. Claims Rebecca is an unfit mother due to homelessness and inability to provide stable housing." Rebecca's world tilted. "He can't do that. He has no legal standing." "Actually, he does," Jake said grimly. "As Carlos's brother and Tommy's uncle, he can petition for emergency custody if he can prove neglect or endangerment, and technically being homeless with a child. But he's the one who stole our money." Rebecca's voice rose to near hysteria. "Which we can't prove without documentation." Jake's military training kept his voice steady even as anger burned in his eyes. "We have 72 hours before the hearing. If we can't produce evidence of Marcus's fraud by then—" He didn't need to finish. They all understood what losing meant. Tommy, seemingly oblivious to the adult panic around him, walked to the window and pressed his hand against the glass. Thunder immediately stopped pacing and approached, lowering his massive head until it was level with the boy's face. For a long moment they stared at each other through the glass. "He wants to show us something," Tommy announced. "He's been trying to tell us all morning." Jake's rational mind rejected the idea that a bull could communicate complex information, but 3 years of living with Thunder had taught him that the animal possessed intelligence beyond normal bovine behavior, and if Carlos had trained him— "Rebecca," Jake said slowly, "did Carlos ever mention anything about emergency plans, backup documentation, anything he might have hidden in case something happened to him?" Rebecca shook her head, but then paused. "He always said he was a belt and suspenders kind of soldier. Said he never trusted anything important to just one safeguard." Her eyes widened. "But I thought he meant the life insurance policy." "Maybe he did more than that," Jake said, watching Thunder's continued agitation. "Maybe he prepared for the possibility that even the insurance could be compromised." Diana Walsh arrived at noon, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and her navy blazer bearing a small pin indicating her veteran status. She was all business as she spread legal documents across Jake's kitchen table, but her expression grew increasingly grave as she reviewed the situation. "Marcus has done this before," she said, pulling up records on her tablet. 3 other military families over the past 5 years. Each time, he gained their trust, convinced them to invest life insurance or survivor benefits, then disappeared when the investments went bad. But he was careful, always stayed within legal boundaries, always had documentation to support his version of events. "What about the other families?" Rebecca asked. "Lost everything?" "2 children ended up in foster care when their mothers couldn't prove fraud." Diana's voice was clinical, but Jake could see the anger burning in her eyes. "Marcus Webb is a predator who specifically targets military widows, and he's very good at what he does." Thunder's calling intensified outside, the deep sounds carrying a note of urgency that made everyone in the kitchen look toward the window. The bull had moved to the gate, his massive frame pressed against the metal as if trying to force his way out. "He wants to go somewhere," Tommy said, walking to the door. "He's been trying to tell us all day." "Tommy, stay inside," Rebecca called, but Jake was already moving toward the door. "Let's see what he's trying to show us," Jake said, his military instincts telling him to trust the animal's unusual behavior. Outside, Thunder's agitation was even more pronounced. The moment Jake approached the gate, the bull began moving toward the eastern edge of the property, stopping every few yards to look back and ensure Jake was following. It was clear, purposeful behavior, not the random wandering of a distressed animal, but the directed movement of a creature with a destination in mind. Jake followed Thunder across the pasture, his prosthetic leg making the walk difficult in the muddy ground. Rebecca and Tommy trailed behind, with Diana Walsh reluctantly joining the strange procession. Thunder led them to a section of fence that bordered the neighboring property, an abandoned farm that had been for sale for years. Thunder stopped at the fence line and began pawing at the ground near a large oak tree, his hooves churning up mud and grass. He looked back at Jake, then resumed his digging, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like speech. "He's trying to tell us something's buried there," Tommy said with absolute certainty. Jake stared at the spot where Thunder was digging, then at the neighboring property beyond the fence. Something was nagging at the back of his mind. A conversation from years ago, words Carlos had spoken during one of their late-night talks in the barracks. "Always have a backup plan for your backup plan," Carlos had said. "And never put all your eggs in one basket, especially when it comes to family." Jake looked at Thunder, who had stopped digging and was staring at him with those intelligent dark eyes. The bull's message was clear. Whatever they were looking for wasn't on Jake's property. It was on the abandoned farm next door. "Diana," Jake said, his voice tight with sudden understanding, "I need you to find out who owns that property." As Diana made phone calls to the county records office, Thunder maintained his vigil by the fence, occasionally calling out toward the abandoned farm buildings in the distance. His behavior had the quality of a soldier waiting for orders, ready to advance but requiring permission to proceed. The answer came within an hour. The abandoned property was owned by a holding company registered to one Marcus Webb. The revelation that Marcus owned the neighboring property hit like a thunderbolt. Jake stared across the fence at the abandoned farmhouse, its broken windows and sagging porch suddenly taking on sinister significance. If Carlos had hidden backup documentation, and if Thunder somehow knew about it, then Marcus had been sitting on the evidence of his own crimes for 3 years. "We need to get onto that property," Jake said, his military mind already calculating options. "If Carlos hid something there—" "It's trespassing," Diana warned, though her tone suggested she was considering the legal ramifications rather than dismissing the idea entirely. "Anything we find could be inadmissible in court." "Not if we have probable cause," Jake replied, watching Thunder's continued agitation at the fence line. "And that bull is giving us probable cause." Thunder had begun a new behavior, deliberately running along the fence line, then returning to the same spot near the oak tree. His pattern was consistent, purposeful, as if he were trying to demonstrate a route or pathway. Each time he completed the circuit, he would stop and look directly at Jake, his dark eyes holding an intelligence that was impossible to ignore. "He's showing us how to get there," Tommy said, his small hand pressed against the fence. "Thunder knows the way." Rebecca knelt beside her son, her heart breaking at his innocent faith in the bull's abilities. But even as her rational mind rejected the idea that an animal could understand such complex concepts, she couldn't deny Thunder's unusual behavior. The bull was clearly trying to communicate something vital. "There's an old access road on the other side of the property," Jake said, pointing toward a barely visible dirt track that wound through the trees. "Hunters used to use it before the place was abandoned, if we approach from that direction." "Jake," Diana said firmly, "I cannot advise you to break into that property. As your legal counsel, I have to tell you that anything you find through illegal means will be thrown out of court." "Then don't advise us," Jake replied, his jaw set with military determination. "You can wait here while we take a look around. What you don't know can't hurt you professionally." Diana opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. She'd been a Navy JAG officer for 20 years before going into private practice. She understood the difference between legal advice and moral obligation, and she could see the desperation in Rebecca's eyes. "If you were to hypothetically find something on that property," Diana said carefully. And if you were to hypothetically call the authorities to report suspected criminal activity, any evidence discovered during an official investigation would be admissible. Jake nodded grimly. Hypothetically speaking, of course. The plan was simple in its desperation. Jake and Rebecca would approach the abandoned farm through the old access road while Diana remained at the ranch with Tommy, maintaining plausible deniability. Thunder, somehow, would guide them to whatever Carlos had hidden. But as they prepared to leave, Thunder's behavior changed dramatically. The bull began throwing his weight against the fence with increasing violence, his calls becoming deeper and more urgent. The metal posts groaned under his assault, and Jake realized with growing alarm that Thunder was going to break through whether they opened the gate or not. "He's not waiting," Rebecca said, backing away from the fence as Thunder's desperation reached a crescendo. With a final tremendous heave, Thunder snapped the fence wire and pushed through the gap he'd created. For a moment, Jake thought the bull might bolt, might run wild across the countryside in his agitation. Instead, Thunder stopped just beyond the fence and looked back at them, waiting. "He wants us to follow," Tommy said, somehow having appeared beside the broken fence despite Diana's attempts to keep him back. "Thunder's going to show us Daddy's secret." Jake made a decision that went against every rational thought in his head. "We follow him. All of us." "Jake, this is insane," Diana protested, but she was already moving toward her car. "We can't let a bull lead us on some wild chase across private property." "That bull has been right about everything so far," Jake replied, opening the passenger door of his truck. "I'm not betting against him now." Thunder set off across the abandoned farm with purposeful strides, occasionally looking back to ensure the small convoy of vehicles was following. He led them not to the farmhouse, as Jake had expected, but to an old barn that sat in a depression between two hills, hidden from view of the main road. The barn was in better condition than the house, its roof intact and its walls solid despite years of neglect. Thunder stopped at the large sliding door and began pawing at the ground, his hooves striking something metallic buried beneath years of accumulated dirt and debris. Jake climbed out of his truck, his prosthetic leg protesting the uneven ground. "There's something under there." Working together, they cleared away the debris to reveal a heavy metal plate, an old storm cellar door that had been concealed by time and weather. Thunder positioned himself directly over the door, his massive weight making it clear that this was their destination. "Carlos must have known about this place," Rebecca said, staring at the hidden entrance. "But how did Thunder—" "Carlos trained him," Jake said with growing certainty. "Somehow, someway, Carlos prepared Thunder for this exact situation. He knew Marcus might betray you, so he created a backup plan." Diana knelt beside the metal door, running her hands along its edges. "This has been opened recently." "Within the last few years, I'd say." Jake found the handle and pulled, his muscles straining against the weight and rust. The door opened with a groan of protesting metal, revealing wooden steps leading down into darkness. The air that escaped carried the scent of dry earth and something else, the faint odor of documents and plastic storage containers. Thunder immediately moved to the opening, lowering his massive head toward the stairs and letting out a soft, encouraging sound. His message was unmistakable. This was what they'd been searching for. But as Jake prepared to descend into the hidden cellar, the sound of car engines reached them across the abandoned farm. Through the trees they could see vehicles approaching on the main road, expensive cars that didn't belong in this desolate place. Marcus Webb had arrived, and he wasn't alone. Marcus Webb stepped out of his black Mercedes like a man accustomed to controlling every situation. At 52, he carried himself with the polished confidence of a successful financial advisor, his expensive suit and manicured appearance a stark contrast to the abandoned farm around him. But Jake could see the desperation behind the facade, the slight tremor in Marcus's hands, the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. Two other men emerged from a second vehicle, both wearing the kind of cheap suits that suggested hired muscle rather than legitimate business associates. Jake's military training automatically cataloged threats: the bulge under one man's jacket, the way they positioned themselves to block escape routes, the professional manner in which they surveyed the area. "Rebecca," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the barn lot with false warmth. "Thank God you're safe." When I heard about the eviction, I was worried sick. Thunder's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The massive bull positioned himself directly between Marcus and the hidden cellar entrance, his head lowered in a posture Jake had never seen before. It wasn't aggression exactly, but it was clearly a warning. Thunder's intelligent eyes never left Marcus, tracking his movement with the focused attention of a guard dog. "Stay behind Thunder," Jake murmured to Rebecca and Tommy, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where he'd once carried a sidearm. "Whatever happens, keep that bull between you and them." Marcus approached with careful steps, his eyes taking in the broken fence, the vehicles, and most importantly, the open storm cellar. His composed expression flickered for just a moment, a flash of panic that confirmed Jake's worst suspicions. "I see you found my little property," Marcus said, stopping just outside Thunder's range. "I've been meaning to clean this place up, but you know how it is with abandoned buildings. Always full of surprises." Diana stepped forward, her legal training taking over despite the dangerous situation. "Mr. Webb, I'm Diana Walsh, Mrs. Hayes's attorney. We need to discuss the irregularities in your handling of her husband's life insurance benefits." Marcus's laugh was hollow, tinged with desperation. "Irregularities. I've managed Rebecca's investments exactly as she requested. Every transaction is documented, every decision approved." "Then you won't mind if we examine the contents of that cellar," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to combat situations. "Shouldn't be anything there that concerns you." "Actually, there is," Marcus replied, his mask of civility finally slipping. "That cellar contains private documents related to my business dealings. Documents that certain parties would find embarrassing." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Rebecca felt her knees weaken as the full scope of Marcus's betrayal became clear. He wasn't just a thief, he was a career criminal who'd used Carlos's death as cover for his operations. "You bastard," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "Carlos trusted you. He asked you to take care of his family, and you—" "Carlos was dead!" Marcus exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. "Dead and buried while I was facing bankruptcy, medical bills that would destroy everything I'd worked for. That money was just sitting there doing nothing for a dead man while I was dying." The raw honesty of his desperation was almost more shocking than his crimes. Jake could see the truth written in Marcus's haggard features. This wasn't pure greed, but the desperate actions of a man facing his own mortality. "Medical bills?" Diana asked, her attorney's instincts picking up on the admission. Marcus's hand moved unconsciously to his chest. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 18 months to live, they said. Experimental treatments not covered by insurance. $200,000 just for a chance to see another Christmas." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Jake had seen desperate men before, had watched good soldiers make terrible choices when pushed beyond their limits. But using a fallen comrade's family as a source of funding for personal medical treatment crossed every line of military honor. "So you decided to steal from a widow and orphan," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "You decided that your life was worth more than the future Carlos died to provide for his son." "I was going to pay it back," Marcus shouted, but his words rang hollow even to himself. The investments were supposed to work. "I was supposed to beat this thing and return everything with interest." Thunder had been listening to the exchange with the uncanny attention Jake had come to expect, but now the bull began moving, not aggressively, but with clear purpose. He walked to the cellar entrance and began descending the wooden steps, his massive form disappearing into the darkness below. "What the hell is that animal doing?" one of Marcus's associates asked, his hand moving toward his jacket. "Don't," Jake warned, stepping forward with military precision. "That bull is worth more than your life to me, and I've got nothing left to lose." From below came the sound of thunder moving around in the confined space, followed by a deep, resonant call that seemed to echo up from the earth itself. Then came other sounds, the scrape of metal, the thud of heavy objects being moved. "He's getting the evidence," Tommy said with absolute certainty, his small hand slipping into his mother's. "Thunder knows where Daddy hid the important papers." Marcus's face went ashen. "That's impossible. There's no way a dumb animal could—" His words were cut off as Thunder emerged from the cellar carrying something in his mouth, a waterproof military-grade document case, the kind used to protect critical papers in combat zones. The bull approached Rebecca and gently placed the case at her feet, then stepped back with what could only be described as satisfaction. Diana knelt and opened the case with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of documents, copies of every investment agreement Marcus had presented to Rebecca, bank statements showing the systematic theft, and most damning of all, a detailed letter from Carlos outlining his suspicions about his brother's financial difficulties and his preparations for protecting his family's future. "Carlos knew," Rebecca breathed, reading over Diana's shoulder. "He knew you were in trouble, and he planned for this." The letter was devastating in its clarity. Carlos had documented Marcus's gambling debts, his failed business ventures, even his cancer diagnosis. But rather than confronting his brother directly, Carlos had created an elaborate safeguard system, using Thunder as the key component. "The bull was trained to lead you here," Diana said, reading from Carlos's detailed instructions. "Specific scent triggers, behavioral cues, even GPS coordinates buried in the training protocols, Carlos turned Thunder into a living insurance policy." Marcus staggered backward, the weight of his brother's foresight crushing his remaining hopes. "He planned all of this? Even even knowing what I might do?" "He loved you," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face as she read Carlos's final words about his brother. "But he loved his family more. And he trusted Thunder to make sure the right choice was made when the time came." The sound of sirens in the distance announced that Diana had managed to call for help while the confrontation unfolded. Marcus's associates were already moving toward their car, abandoning their employer to face the consequences alone. "Don't run," Jake called to Marcus, who was stumbling toward his Mercedes. "Face this with some dignity. It's what Carlos would have wanted." Marcus stopped, his shoulders sagging with defeat. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was so scared of dying alone and broke." "You wouldn't have died alone," Rebecca said quietly. "If you'd just asked for help instead of stealing it, Carlos's family would have stood by you. That's what family does." As the police cars pulled into the barn lot, Thunder moved to stand beside Tommy, lowering his massive head so the boy could rest against his neck. The sight of the gentle giant comforting Carlos's son while justice finally arrived was almost too perfect to be real. But it was real, Jake realized. Carlos Martinez had reached across death itself to protect his family, using loyalty and love and the incredible intelligence of a faithful bull to ensure that his final promise would be kept. The truth was finally free, and Thunder's long vigil was nearly over. 6 months later, the Texas sun cast long golden shadows across Jake's ranch as children's laughter echoed from the newly constructed playground behind the main house. Rebecca's dream of opening a daycare had become reality, funded by the recovered life insurance money and supported by a community that had rallied around Carlos's story. The Thunder's Promise Child Care Center served 15 local families, with Rebecca as director and Jake as the unlikely but beloved groundskeeper who told the best stories about brave soldiers and loyal animals. Thunder had become the gentle giant of the operation, carefully supervised but actively involved in the children's daily activities. The massive bull had proven to have an almost supernatural patience with small humans, allowing them to brush his coat, feed him carrots, and even take carefully supervised rides on his broad back. Parents initially expressed concern about having a 200-pound animal so close to their children, but Thunder's reputation as a hero had spread throughout the community, and his gentle nature with youngsters was undeniable. Tommy, now 7 and thriving in his new environment, had appointed himself Thunder's official interpreter. He spent hours each day with the bull, claiming to understand every snort, every head movement, every position of Thunder's ears. Whether the boy truly communicated with the animal or simply possessed an intuitive understanding of Thunder's moods, the partnership had become legendary in their small corner of Texas. "Thunder says the new baby goats are ready to meet the other children," Tommy announced one afternoon, leading a small group of 4-year-olds toward the pen where 2 kid goats played under Thunder's watchful protection. The bull had somehow adopted the role of herd guardian for all the small animals on the property, from chickens to rabbits to the goats that had arrived as part of the daycare's educational farm program. Jake watched from the porch, his prosthetic leg propped up on a wooden stool as he sorted through the morning mail. At 68, he felt more alive than he had in years. The constant presence of children had awakened something in him that he'd thought dead since Mary's passing, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own pain. The kids called him Grandpa Jake, and he'd stopped correcting them months ago. Rebecca emerged from the daycare building carrying a tray of afternoon snacks, her face bright with contentment that still sometimes surprised her. The transformation from desperate widow to successful businesswoman hadn't been easy, but Thunder's intervention had changed everything. The community support following the Marcus Webb scandal had been overwhelming, with local businesses donating supplies, volunteer labor helping with construction, and veteran families forming the core of her clientele. "Any word from Diana about Marcus?" Rebecca asked, settling beside Jake on the porch swing they'd installed to accommodate his need for frequent rests. Jake held up a legal document. "Sentenced this morning. 5 years federal prison for fraud, but he'll likely serve 3 with good behavior. Diana says the cancer treatment is working, experimental therapy funded by the Veterans Support Group." The complexity of Marcus's situation had torn at Rebecca's heart for months. The man had stolen her family's future, had manipulated her grief for his own desperate purposes. Yet she couldn't forget Carlos's words about forgiveness and family loyalty. In the end, she'd testified at his sentencing hearing, not to minimize his crimes, but to request mercy based on his medical condition and the genuine remorse he'd shown. "Carlos would be proud of you," Jake said, watching Rebecca's face as she processed the news. "Taking the high road when you had every right to demand blood." "Thunder taught me that," Rebecca replied, watching the bull gently nudge a fallen child back to her feet with his massive head. "Loyalty doesn't mean being blind to someone's faults. It means loving them enough to hold them accountable while still offering hope for redemption." The wisdom in her words struck Jake as profound, the kind of insight that came from experiencing the worst of human nature while still choosing to believe in the best. Thunder had been more than Carlos's final gift to his family. He'd been a teacher, showing them all how to balance justice with mercy, strength with gentleness. Diana Walsh had become a regular visitor to the ranch, initially for legal matters but increasingly for personal reasons. Her friendship with Rebecca had deepened into something approaching sisterhood, and her expertise had proven invaluable in establishing the daycare as a legitimate business. More importantly, Her connections in the veteran community had brought other military families to the center, creating a network of mutual support that extended far beyond childcare. "Speaking of thunder," Diana said, arriving for their weekly dinner with her arms full of legal documents and a chocolate cake from the local bakery, "I got a call from a television producer today. They want to do a documentary about Carlos's story, the training, the investigation, the recovery of the money. They're calling it Thunder's Promise, a soldier's love story." Rebecca and Jake exchanged glances. The media attention following Marcus's arrest had been intense but respectful, focusing on themes of military sacrifice and animal loyalty rather than sensationalizing the criminal aspects. Still, the idea of revisiting those painful months for entertainment purposes felt uncomfortable. "What do you think, Thunder?" Tommy called from the playground, apparently having overheard the conversation despite being 30 yards away. "Do you want to be on TV?" Thunder lifted his massive head from the water trough where he'd been drinking and looked directly at the adults on the porch. For a moment, Jake could have sworn the bull was considering the question with human-like deliberation. Then Thunder snorted once, a sound Tommy had taught everyone meant no, and returned to his water. "Thunder says he's already famous enough," Tommy announced with authority. "He just wants to take care of his family." The simplicity of the boy's translation captured something essential about their situation. Thunder had never sought fame or recognition for his role in exposing Marcus's crimes. The bull had simply done what Carlos had trained him to do: protect the family, guide them to safety, and ensure that love triumphed over betrayal. As evening approached and the last of the daycare children were picked up by their parents, the ranch settled into its peaceful routine. Thunder made his final patrol of the property, checking on the smaller animals and ensuring that all gates were properly secured. His military training was evident in the systematic way he approached his duties, a four-legged sentry maintaining watch over his domain. Jake prepared for bed in the small apartment he'd built adjacent to the main house, giving Rebecca and Tommy privacy while remaining close enough to help with security and maintenance. His PTSD symptoms had diminished significantly over the past months, the combination of purpose, community, and Thunder's calming presence providing better therapy than any medication he'd tried. Rebecca tucked Tommy into bed in the room that had once been Mary's sewing space, now transformed into a boy's bedroom complete with military memorabilia and pictures of Carlos in uniform. The toy soldier Carlos had given him still sat on the nightstand, but it was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a reminder of the promises that love makes possible. "Mama," Tommy said as Rebecca kissed him goodnight, "do you think Daddy knows about Thunder keeping his promise?" Rebecca looked out the window where Thunder stood silhouetted against the star-filled Texas sky, a massive guardian maintaining his eternal vigil. "I think he does, sweetheart," she whispered. "I think he's very proud of all of us." Outside, Thunder settled into his favorite sleeping position, facing east toward the sunrise, ready to greet another day of protecting the family Carlos had entrusted to his care. In a world where promises are often broken and families drift apart, Thunder's story reminds us that love finds a way to keep its word, even across the divide of death. Carlos Martinez couldn't return from Afghanistan to protect his family, but his love transcended loss through the loyalty of a gentle giant who understood that some bonds are unbreakable. For those of us who've lived long enough to bury friends, watch children grow distant, or feel forgotten by a world that values youth over wisdom, Thunder's devotion speaks to something profound in the human heart. We yearn for that kind of unwavering loyalty, that certainty that someone will always have our backs when the storms of life hit hardest. Jake found his purpose again at 68, not in dwelling on past glories, but in opening his heart to new family bonds. Rebecca discovered that grief doesn't have to mean giving up on dreams. Sometimes it means fighting harder to honor them. In our golden years, we're not just survivors of our own stories, we're the keepers of promises for the next generation. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the love we leave behind and the loyalty we inspire in others. What promises are you still keeping for someone you've lost? Have you ever experienced the kind of loyalty that Thunder showed Carlos's family?